Well, it was a shock, but it was no surprise, really, was it, when we got the news mid-morning on Friday last that opposition leader in Russia, Navalny, had died. He'd been sent out to some utterly appalling place, a modern-day equivalent of the Gulag, out in Siberia. And we've been hearing reports about prisoners made to stand out in the freezing cold for up to 40 minutes if they move, being hosed down with cold water. The whole thing sounded pretty brutal and pretty awful. And it was disappointing in some ways that Tucker Carlson didn't ask in that interview about Navalny. He asked about an American journalist, but not about Navalny. So many journalists, so many politicians who've got in the way of Putin have died. I think that says an awful lot about him as a man. The body has not been released to the family. His mother went to the camp to try and seek it. The news that we've had today that's come from a doctor is that the body was very heavily bruised. His wife, Yulia, says she believes, has every reason to believe, that Novichok poison was used, and that the reason for the bruises is trying to physically contain someone that is having convulsions. I don't know much about this subject, but Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, former commanding officer of the UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear regiment, would know far more than anyone. Hamish, there is a history, isn't there, a record of Vladimir Putin, or those that operate on his behalf or believe they are, using Novichok, using other chemical and nerve agents, and indeed there was a previous attempt, was there not, on Navalny's life?
Good evening, Nigel. Yes, absolutely. The murder, as I think it probably is, of Navalny has all the hallmarks of the Russian Secret Service, which of course is synonymous with Putin anyway. And the use of toxic chemicals to do that is a particular desire of the Russians. Litvinenko was killed with polonium-210 in the UK back in 2006. Where I'm talking to you from Salisbury in 2018, Sergei Skripal was tried to be assassinated with Novichok. And as you say, Alexei Navalny was poisoned with Novichok in August 2020 in Russia, and he somehow survived. So the fact that he looked pretty well on Thursday evening when he was last seen on TV and then died on Friday, the Russians said it was sudden cardiac death syndrome. Now, that is a syndrome I have. I know a lot about it, and certainly Navalny didn't look like somebody who had that particular syndrome. I might say that it's only people who sort of die on sports pitches of it. If you know you've got it, you can do a lot about it. So the accusation that it is Novichok would make a lot of sense, because we know the Russians designed this deadly nerve agent to be undetectable. So as you said, the body is probably not going to be released for 14 days. So the chances of a rudimentary post-mortem in Russia actually finding it are pretty unlikely. So we'll probably never know how he died, but I think it's clear to most people that he was died to get him out of the way, probably ahead of Putin's alleged sham election on the 12th of March.
Yeah, no, and I mean, there's no question the guy had considerable support in Russia. He was the main opposition voice. And Hamish, David Cameron responded very strongly, saying there should be consequences for what he's done. There has been, you know, pretty much unanimity of revulsion amongst the West. And yet, militarily, Russia have made another advance over the course of the last 48 hours. Do you sense, despite the words of David Cameron and others, that actually the West's resolve to continually pump money into Ukraine is beginning to tire?
Well, first of all, I think David Cameron's doing a good job getting around the place, getting to the Falklands today. One of the reasons I think Putin has been on the loose, as it were, because he didn't think the West would do anything about it, which is why he invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. And everybody remembers the Obama red line on chemical weapon use, which again, the West sort of ignored. And somebody like Putin only responds to strength. But as you say, particularly in the US, there is waverings about supporting Ukraine. I hope people in this country and around Europe and the States realize that Putin has no limits. You know, if he's quite happy to murder one of his members of his country like Navalny, then he's probably prepared to do anything. And I think what everybody needs to understand, if Putin prevails in Ukraine, he's not going to stop there. He's going to keep going west. So I think it's to all of us to redouble our efforts to support Ukraine. And the US obviously is key to this, and whether the 60 billion package is signed off or not, hopefully it will be, because again, that sends a message. And Ukraine's running ammunition. This is ridiculous. The Danes today, thankfully, have said they'll empty their ammunition stores and give it to Ukraine. Quite frankly, if we don't support Ukraine, we might well find ourselves with our own beleaguered military having to fight the Russians in Europe on European soil in the next couple of years.
Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, thank you, as ever, for your voice on this. And, of course, none of us can know whether Hamish is right. None of us can know, after Ukraine, whether Putin would go for Moldova, whether he would go for Poland, whether he would go for Estonia. We don't know the answers to any of this. There are some who look at history and say, well, it's a bit like the 1930s. It's a dictator that takes a bit and keeps on taking. There are others that say, no, even Putin isn't that mad as to provoke a war against NATO. None of us can know the truth of it. What we can know is that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Ukraine, that it is almost a First World War-style tragedy, almost the Somme with drones that is going on in Ukraine, and that it's loathsome.